The great assembly hall of Arcturus Station buzzed with the sounds of 47 different species. Translators hummed softly as creatures of scales, fur, crystal, and energy spoke in their native tongues. At the center of it all stood a human. Man in a simple blue uniform, his hands clasped behind his back as he waited for the noise to settle. Ambassador Marcus Williams had been chosen carefully for this moment. His face was kind but not weak. His voice carried authority without being harsh, and most importantly, his smile seemed genuine. The humans had studied every detail of this first contact for months. They knew exactly what impression they wanted to make. Honored members of the Galactic Council, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the translation systems. Stand before you today, not as a conqueror or a supplicant, but as a neighbor who has finally learned to reach across the stars. The crystalline Ashali delegate, a being of living gemstone, whose thoughts moved like light through her transparent body, leaned forward with interest. The ancient Corvin, whose tree-like forms had seen empires rise and fall, rustled their leaves in what humans had learned was approval. Even the warlike Drachner, massive reptilian beings who respected only strength, seemed curious about these newcomers. Marcus continued his prepared speech, telling the story of humanity's journey from a divided world to a unified species. He spoke of wars that had taught them the value of peace, of conflicts that had shown them the price of hatred. He painted a picture of a species that had learned hard lessons and emerged wiser for them. We come to you not seeking dominance, but partnership, Marcus said, his arms spread wide in a gesture of openness. Humanity has spent too long fighting ourselves. We wish to spend our future building alongside others. Dr. Rebecca Thompson stepped forward when Marcus finished, where he was diplomatic and formal. She was warm and enthusiastic. Her presentation filled the great screens around the hall with images of human art, music, and literature. She showed them paintings that captured the beauty of Earth's sunsets, played music that made even the logical silicon-based Vex sway slightly, and read poetry that spoke of hope and wonder. This is what humanity creates when we are not at war, Rebecca said, her eyes bright with passion. This is what we wish to share with the galaxy, the assembled delegates murmured among themselves. The Ashali delegate, whose name was Lyra, found herself genuinely moved by the human expressions of creativity. The Corvin elders nodded approvingly at the depth of human philosophical thought. Even the Drachner seemed puzzled but interested by humanity's apparent transformation from warriors to artists. Council leader Thane, eldest of the Corvin, raised one massive branch-like arm. These displays are impressive, Ambassador Williams, but we have seen your species' history. Your wars were ... extensive. How do we know this change is permanent? Marcus's smile never wavered. Honored Thane, I understand your concern. Our history is not something we hide from or feel ashamed of. It is something we have learned from. Every human child learns about the wars of the past, not to glorify them, but to understand their cost. We have seen what happens when a species turns its weapons on itself. We choose a different path. He gestured to Rebecca, who brought up new images on the screens. These showed human colonies working together. Different ethnic groups that had once fought now building side by side. Cities that had been bombed during the old wars now stood as monuments to cooperation and peace. We offer proof through action. Not just words, Marcus said. Our colonies are open to inspection. Our military exists only for defense and disaster relief. Our technology focuses on healing, building, and exploring rather than destroying. The debate that followed lasted for hours. Some delegates worried about humanity's rapid technological advancement. Others questioned whether any species could truly change so completely. The Drachner representative, a scarred veteran named Krell, was particularly skeptical. No species abandons the warrior's path completely, Krell growled, his voice like grinding stone. What happens when you face a threat that cannot be reasoned with? What happens when your peaceful words fail? Marcus met the Drachner's challenging stare calmly. Then we will defend ourselves and our allies with everything we have. But we will not strike first, and we will not fight for conquest. There is a difference between being defenseless and being peaceful. The Ashali delegate Lyra spoke for the first time, her voice like crystal bells. The humans show us beauty and speak of peace, but they also show strength without aggression. This is ... unusual. Most species we encounter are either too weak to matter or too strong to trust. Perhaps, suggested the elderly Corvin leader, that is exactly what the galaxy needs. A species strong enough to stand with us, but wise enough to choose peace. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than the humans had hoped, but decisive enough to matter. 31 species voted to welcome humanity into the Galactic Council. 12 voted against, mostly led by the Drachner and their allies. Abstained, including some of the more cautious neutral species. As the session ended and delegates began to file out, Marcus remained at the podium, shaking hands. Tentacles, claws, and other appendages, as various beings came to congratulate him. His aide, Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes, watched from the sidelines, making mental notes of who seemed genuinely friendly and who was merely being polite. Later that evening, in the privacy of their quarters aboard the human diplomatic ship, Marcus finally let his formal smile fade. He poured himself a glass of Earth whiskey and settled into a comfortable chair across from David. "How do you think it went?" David asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Marcus took a sip of his drink and allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "Better than expected. Yashali are curious about us, which could be useful or dangerous depending on how curious. The Corvin seemed genuinely approving, which gives us legitimacy with the older species. Even some of the Drachners seemed interested rather than hostile, than the ones who voted against us. Exactly who we expected. Krell and his faction were never going to trust us immediately. But notice how they phrased their objections. They're worried about our strength, not our weakness. That tells us something important about how they see us." David nodded, understanding the implication. The soft approach is working then. Marcus raised his glass in a small toast. Phase 1 complete. We're no longer outsiders looking in. We're members of the galactic community with all the rights and responsibilities that brings. Now, the real work begins. Outside their ship's viewport, Arcturus Station continued its slow rotation against the stars. Somewhere on that station, 47 different species were settling in for their rest cycles, most of them feeling optimistic about the newest addition to their community. The humans seemed like exactly what the galaxy needed, strong enough to contribute, wise enough not to threaten, and creative enough to bring something new to their ancient civilization. If any of them had looked more carefully at the human diplomatic ship, they might have noticed that its sensors were more sophisticated than necessary for a simple diplomatic mission. If they had studied the crew manifest more closely, they might have wondered why a diplomatic vessel needed so many technical specialists. If they had been more suspicious by nature, they might have asked themselves why a species that claimed to value peace above all else had spent so much time making sure their first impression was absolutely perfect. But they were not suspicious. Gosh! They wanted to believe that the galaxy had finally found a species that could be both strong and trustworthy. They wanted to believe that humanity's smile was exactly what it appeared to be. The humans were counting on exactly that kind of trust. 3 years had passed since humanity joined the Galactic Council, and their reputation as the galaxy's most helpful species was already legendary. When the Zephyrian homeworld began dying, choked by industrial pollution that their technology could not reverse, human response was swift and generous. Dr. Michael Chen stood on the observation deck of the terraforming station orbiting Zephyria Prime, watching as massive atmospheric processors worked to clean the planet's poisoned air. His team had worked without rest for 6 months, using techniques that combined human engineering with knowledge gained from studying dozens of other species. Environmental methods. The oxygen levels are up another 2% this week, reported his assistant, Dr. Lisa Park, as she reviewed the latest atmospheric readings. At this rate, the Zephyrians will be able to remove their breathing masks in populated areas within the year. Michael nodded, but his attention was focused on the data streaming across his personal tablet. While his official mission was saving Zephyria, his real work was much more comprehensive. Every atmospheric sample, every soil analysis, every environmental Scan was being quietly copied and sent back to human research stations. They were learning exactly how Zephyrian biology responded to different atmospheric conditions, what toxins affected them most severely, and what environmental changes would be most devastating to their species. It was all perfectly innocent, of course. Understanding alien biology was essential for providing proper medical care. Knowing environmental tolerances was crucial for terraforming work. The fact that this same information could be used for far less benevolent purposes was simply an unfortunate coincidence on the other side of the galaxy. Captain Ana Rodriguez was dealing with a very different kind of problem. The Outer Rim had been plagued by pirates for months, with raiders attacking trade convoys and stealing cargo shipments meant for frontier colonies. The local species had requested help from the Galactic Council, but traditional military responses had failed to stop the attacks. Anna's fleet consisted of only 12 ships, but they moved through space with a precision that impressed even the normally contemptuous Drachner observers. Her tactics were unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Instead of trying to fight the pirates in straight battle, she studied their patterns, learned their habits, and predicted their next moves. "Contact the merchant vessel Golden Wing," Anna ordered from her command chair aboard the human cruiser Persistence. "Tell them to alter course to the Kepler Junction and maintain standard speed." Her tactical officer, Commander Tom Walsh, looked puzzled. "Ma'am, that route takes them directly through the pirates' preferred hunting ground." Anna smiled, the same kind of calm, confident expression that had become associated with human leadership. "Exactly. Sometimes the best way to catch a predator is to offer it exactly what it wants." The trap worked perfectly. The pirates took the bait, attacking the seemingly vulnerable merchant ship, only to find themselves surrounded by human vessels that had been waiting in the asteroid field nearby. But instead of destroying the pirate ships, Anna's fleet used weapons that disabled their engines and communications without killing the crews. When the pirates were captured, alive and unharmed, the Drachner military commander overseeing the operation was genuinely confused. "Captain Rodriguez, why did you not destroy them? They're enemies of galactic peace." "Because dead pirates tell no stories," Anna replied calmly. "But captured pirates can tell us about their organization, their funding, their next targets. Information is often more valuable than destruction." What she didn't mention was that the human interrogation techniques being used on the captured pirates were far more sophisticated than anything the Galactic Council had seen before. The humans had spent decades perfecting psychological methods that could extract information without the subject even realizing they were being questioned. By the time the pirates were handed over to local authorities, human intelligence had gained detailed knowledge of criminal networks throughout the Outer Rim. Back on Arcturus Station, Dr. Rebecca Thompson continued her cultural exchange programs. But these had evolved far beyond simple art appreciation. Human cultural centers now existed on 40 different worlds, offering everything from cooking classes to musical instruction. Alien children learned human games, alien adults read human literature, and alien artists collaborated with human creators on joint projects. What none of them realized was that every interaction was being carefully monitored and analyzed. Human psychologists studied how different species responded to various forms of entertainment, which emotional triggers were most effective for each culture, and how alien social structures could be influenced through careful cultural manipulation. The Ashali had always been logical creatures, preferring crystal gardens and mathematical art forms. But after exposure to human music, some of them began creating more emotional, abstract works. The Corvin, traditionally focused on long-term growth and patience, found themselves fascinated by human stories of rapid change and individual heroism. Even the warrior-focused Drachner began incorporating human concepts of honor and sacrifice into their military traditions. None of these changes seemed harmful. In fact, most species reported that contact with human culture had enriched their own societies. What they didn't understand was that they were gradually becoming more human in their thinking patterns, more susceptible to human ways of solving problems, more likely to see the galaxy through human eyes. Ambassador Marcus Williams watched all of these developments from his office on Arcturus Station, reviewing reports that came in from across human space. The official reports spoke of successful, terraforming projects, effective anti-piracy operations, and flourishing cultural exchanges. The classified reports told a very different story. "Our agricultural colonies are ahead of schedule," reported David Hayes, Marcus's aide and the coordinator of humanity's real activities. "All 7 worlds are producing surplus food, but more importantly, they're positioned to control major trade routes if the situation changes." Marcus nodded, studying a holographic map of human settlements. To most observers, the colonies appeared to be scattered randomly across available worlds. But viewed from a strategic perspective, they formed a network that could control or monitor most of the galaxy's major hyperspace lanes. "What about our industrial capacity?" Marcus asked. "Growing faster than anyone realizes," David replied with satisfaction. "The mining operations on the asteroid colonies are extracting rare metals at unprecedented rates. The manufacturing stations are producing everything from medical equipment to agricultural machinery. On paper, we're just helping other species with their needs. In reality, we're building the largest industrial base in the galaxy, asteroid." Mining operations were particularly clever. Humans had volunteered to help other species extract resources from dangerous or difficult locations, using their adaptability and engineering skills to work in environments that other species found challenging. What their partners didn't realize was that for every ton of materials they extracted for others, extracted 3 tons for their own use. The extra materials were processed at hidden facilities and stockpiled at secret locations throughout human space. Marcus turned to another display showing human research stations scattered across the galaxy. Officially, these were scientific outposts studying everything from stellar phenomena to xenobiology. In reality, they were intelligence gathering centers, monitoring communications, tracking ship movements, and maintaining detailed files on every species humanity had encountered. "Any concerns about discovery?" Marcus asked. David shook his head. "God, the beauty of the approach is that we're not actually lying about anything we're doing. We really are helping with terraforming. We really are fighting pirates. We really are promoting cultural exchange. The fact that we're also gathering intelligence and building strategic advantages is just efficient multitasking." On the world of Milani Prime, home to one of the galaxy's most peaceful species, a human medical team was working to combat a plague that had already killed thousands. Dr. Emily Foster worked alongside Milani physicians, teaching them new surgical techniques and sharing advanced medical knowledge that was saving lives every day. But in her private laboratory, Ellie was also conducting much more sensitive research. She was studying how the plague affected different species, how various genetic markers influenced recovery rates, and how certain biological agents could be engineered to target specific racial characteristics. Her work was officially classified as defensive biological research aimed at protecting humanity from potential bioweapons. The fact that the same research could be used to create bioweapons was merely an unfortunate side effect of thorough preparation. The Milani were so grateful for human help that they never questioned why the medical teams needed such extensive genetic samples from their population. They assumed it was all part of the treatment process. They had no idea that humanity was quietly mapping the biological vulnerabilities of every species they encountered. As the 3rd anniversary of humanity's membership in the Galactic Council approached, most species considered them model citizens of the galactic community. They had helped solve dozens of crises, contributed to scientific advancement, and enriched galactic culture with their art and philosophy. There were no complaints about human behavior, no concerns about human intentions, and no suspicions about human activities. The only exception was the Ashali delegate Lyra, whose crystal clear mind had begun to notice patterns that troubled her. Humans always seemed to be in the right place at the right time to help with any crisis. Their solutions were always remarkably effective and surprisingly well prepared. Their cultural exchanges always seemed to benefit human understanding of other species more than the reverse. Most disturbing of all, human settlements were remarkably well defended for supposedly peaceful colonies. Their trade ships carried sensors that were far more sophisticated than necessary for simple commerce. Their medical teams asked questions that seemed to go well beyond what was needed for treatment. Lyra had begun keeping private records of her observations, but she hesitated to share them with the Council. After all, humanity had done nothing but help other species. Their actions had saved lives, prevented wars, and brought prosperity to dozens of worlds. What kind of paranoid mind would look for sinister motives in such obvious benevolence? She had no way of knowing that her hesitation was exactly what the humans were counting on. They had studied galactic psychology carefully, and they understood that most species would rather believe in good intentions than face the possibility that they had been deceived. The galaxy wanted to trust humanity, and humans had given them every reason to do exactly that. Lyra had spent months gathering evidence before she finally decided to act. The crystalline being sat in her private chambers aboard Arcturus Station, her transparent form pulsing with nervous energy as she reviewed the data one more time. What she had discovered would change everything, but she knew that most of the Galactic Council would not want to believe it. Her investigation had started with simple curiosity about human efficiency, but it had led her down a path that revealed the true scope of humanity's deception. She had traced shipping records, analyzed settlement patterns, and used her species' natural affinity for mathematics to find connections that others had missed. Human colonies were not randomly placed. They formed a perfect network of strategic positions that could control every major hyperspace route in the galaxy. Human research stations were positioned to monitor communications between every major species. Human cultural centers were all located in political capitals or near military installations, most damning of all. She had discovered that human trade vessels were carrying military-grade shield generators and weapons systems, hidden beneath their innocent cargo compartments. The humans had essentially militarized their entire merchant fleet without anyone noticing, but her investigation was interrupted by events that would prove her point more dramatically than any evidence she could gather. The Drachner Empire, growing restless after years of peace, had decided to expand their territory by conquering the Milani Federation. It was exactly the kind of unprovoked aggression that the Galactic Council existed to prevent. But the Council's response was slow and divided. The Drachner had chosen their target well. The Milani were pacifists by nature, with only a small defense force meant for emergency evacuation rather than actual combat. Their worlds were rich in resources but poorly defended. Most military experts predicted that the conquest would be completed within months. General Korg, the Drachner commander leading the invasion, was confident of victory as his massive fleet approached the first Milani world. His ships were the most advanced in the Drachner arsenal, crewed by warriors who had never known defeat. The Milani distress calls had been sent to the Galactic Council, but everyone knew that help would arrive too late. Then the human fleet appeared. Admiral Patricia Stone's ships emerged from hyperspace with a precision that should have been impossible. They were not where the Drachner expected them to be, not coming from the direction that made tactical sense, and not limited to the small patrol force that human records suggested they maintained in this sector. Unknown human vessels. This is General Korg of the Drachner Empire, the lizard-like commander broadcast on all frequencies. You are interfering in a legitimate territorial expansion. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences. Admiral Stone's response was calm and measured, delivered in the tone of someone discussing the weather. General Korg, this is Admiral Stone of the Human Defense Force. You are attacking a member species of the Galactic Council. Cease your assault immediately and withdraw to your own territory. Korg laughed, a sound like grinding rocks. Human, you have 12 ships. Have 60. Your species may be clever, but you cannot defy simple mathematics. You're right, Stone replied. I can't defy mathematics, but I suspect your count is wrong. That was when the rest of the human fleet decloaked. The stealth technology that revealed itself was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Over 100 human ships materialized around the Drachner fleet, having somehow moved into position without being detected. But that was not the most shocking part. The most shocking part was how well prepared they were. The human fleet opened fire with weapons that seemed specifically designed to counter Drachner technology, Drachner shields, which had protected their Ships for centuries failed within seconds under concentrated fire from human energy weapons. Drachner armor, which had been considered nearly impenetrable, was pierced by human projectiles that seemed to know exactly where the weak points were located. General Korg watched in horror as his flagship's control systems began failing one by one. The humans were not just attacking his ships. They were attacking them with weapons that exploited specific vulnerabilities in Drachner technology. It was as if the humans had spent years studying every detail of Drachner military equipment and designing counters for each system. Impossible, Korg growled as his weapon systems went offline. How do they know our shield frequencies? The answer would have terrified him if he had known it. Human cultural exchange programs had included Drachner military personnel for 3 years. Human medical teams had treated injured Drachner warriors, studying their biology and their equipment in detail. Human research stations had been monitoring Drachner communications and military exercises constantly. Within hours, the most powerful fleet in Drachner history was either destroyed or captured. The few ships that managed to retreat carried news that would shake the Drachner Empire to its foundation. The humans had not just defeated them, they'd made it look easy, but the victory at Milani Prime was only the beginning. As news of the battle spread across the galaxy, more human capabilities began to reveal themselves. The peaceful colony suddenly had defense platforms that could challenge capital ships. The research stations were revealed to be military command centers coordinating operations across multiple star systems. The merchant vessels shed their disguises and became the supply fleet for the largest military force the galaxy had ever seen. Lyra watched these revelations with a mixture of vindication and horror. Her investigation had been correct, but the scope of human deception was far greater than even she had imagined. She requested an emergency session of the Galactic Council to present her findings. The Great Assembly Hall was filled with tension as delegates tried to process what they had witnessed. The Milani representatives were grateful for their salvation, but confused by the sudden revelation of human military power. The Drachner were humiliated and angry, demanding answers about how their supposedly superior technology had been so easily defeated. Lyra stood at the center of the hall, her crystal form glowing with the intensity of her emotions as she presented 3 years of accumulated evidence. She showed them shipping records that proved human colonies were strategically positioned. She displayed sensor data that revealed the true capabilities of human vessels. She presented communication intercepts that suggested human intelligence. Operations throughout the galaxy. The humans have not been helping us, Lyra declared, her voice ringing like crystal bells throughout the hall. They have been studying us. Every act of kindness has been an intelligence-gathering operation. Every cultural exchange has been a psychological warfare program. Every medical mission has been a biological reconnaissance effort. The response was immediate and divided. The Milani delegates stood to defend humanity, pointing out that they would all be dead if not for human intervention. Several other species agreed, arguing that human actions, regardless of motivation, had saved lives and prevented wars. But other delegates were troubled by Lyra's evidence. Ancient Corvin rustled their leaves in distress as they realized how thoroughly they had been studied. The logical Vec began calculating the implications of human technological superiority. Even some of the militant species were concerned about the idea of being outmaneuvered so completely. Ambassador Marcus Williams listened to the debate with the same calm expression he had worn for 3 years. When called upon to respond, he rose slowly and walked to the center of the hall, his diplomatic smile never wavering. "Honored delegates," he began, his voice carrying the same warmth and sincerity that had won the galaxy's trust. "I understand the concerns that have been raised, and I appreciate the thoroughness of Delegate Lyra's investigation. But I think there may be some misunderstanding about human motivations and methods." He gestured to the displays showing Lyra's evidence. "Yes, our colonies are positioned strategically. When you are a new species in a dangerous galaxy, you choose your settlements carefully. Yes, our ships carry sophisticated sensors and defensive systems. When you care about protecting your people, you prepare for potential threats. Yes, we study other species carefully. When you want to help others effectively, you need to understand them completely. Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. Before continuing, the delegates suggest that our actions have been deceptive, but I would argue that they have been simply prudent. We learned about the galaxy before we joined it. We prepared for multiple contingencies before we committed ourselves to this community. We studied potential problems before they became actual crises. Several delegates nodded, finding his explanation reasonable. But Lyra was not satisfied. Ambassador Williams, your preparedness is remarkably comprehensive, she said, her crystal form pulsing with skeptical energy. You have studied every species' biology, mapped every military installation, and positioned your own forces to control galactic commerce. This goes far beyond simple prudence. Marcus's smile became slightly broader, showing just a hint of teeth. Delegate Lyra, I think you may be underestimating the complexity of galactic diplomacy. When humanity decided to join this community, we committed ourselves completely. That means being prepared to defend our allies, to contribute to galactic security, and to respond effectively to any crisis that might arise. He walked closer to her, his expression remaining friendly, but his words carrying a subtle edge. Milani Federation would have been conquered if we had not been prepared. The Drachner expansion would have continued if we had not been ready to respond. Sometimes the difference between being helpful and being harmless is the difference between being effective and being useless. The debate continued for hours, but Marcus's calm explanations gradually won over most of the delegates. He acknowledged that humanity had been thorough in their preparations, but he framed it as responsible citizenship rather than sinister plotting. He admitted that human intelligence gathering was extensive, but he presented it as necessary security precautions in a dangerous galaxy. Most importantly, he reminded them that human actions had consistently benefited galactic peace and prosperity. The Zephyrians were breathing clean air because of human terraforming. The Outer Rim was safe from pirates because of human military intervention. Dozens of species had benefited from human medical knowledge and cultural exchange. By the end of the session, only a handful of delegates supported Lyra's concerns. The majority voted to accept Marcus's explanations and continue normal relations with humanity. Some even passed resolutions thanking humans for their contributions to galactic security. As the delegates filed out of the assembly hall, Lyra found herself isolated and ignored. Her evidence had been dismissed, her concerns had been overruled, and her warnings had been rejected. Most of her colleagues seemed to think she was being paranoid and ungrateful. But as she watched Ambassador Williams shake hands with delegate after delegate, offering reassurances and accepting congratulations, she noticed something that chilled her crystal core. For just a moment, when he thought no one was watching, Marcus's diplomatic smile faded and was replaced by an expression of cold calculation. He was not a friendly diplomat who had been forced to reveal humanity's strength. He was a predator who had successfully convinced his prey that they were safe. And now that the galaxy had chosen to trust him despite the evidence of deception, he no longer needed to hide his true nature as carefully. The vote had not been about whether the evidence was real. It had been about whether the galaxy was willing to face the implications of that evidence. It had chosen to believe the comfortable lie rather than confront the disturbing truth. Lyra realized with growing horror that humanity had not just been preparing for the possibility of galactic conflict. They had been preparing for the certainty of galactic dominance. The question was no longer whether they would take control, but when and how they would choose to do it. The galaxy had seen humanity's teeth behind the smile, but they had decided to pretend the teeth were not there. By the time they realized their mistake, it would be far too late to do anything about it. The weeks following the Galactic Council session brought changes that most delegates tried to ignore, but which Lyra watched with growing dread. Humanity's true nature was becoming impossible to hide, yet the galaxy seemed determined to look the other way. Admiral Stone's fleet had not returned to human space after defeating the Drachner. Instead, they had taken up positions throughout the former war zone, claiming they needed to maintain peace and prevent further Drachner aggression. What they were actually doing was establishing permanent military bases in some of the most strategically important systems in the galaxy. The human explanation was simple and reasonable. Someone needed to keep the peace after such a major conflict. The Milani were too peaceful to police their own territory effectively. Other species were too far away or too busy with their own concerns. Humanity was simply stepping up to fill a necessary role in galactic security, but Lyra could see the pattern that others refused to acknowledge. Each new human base was positioned to control hyperspace routes, monitor communications, or project power across multiple star systems. The humans were not just keeping peace, they were building an empire. On the Corvin homeworld of Ancient Grove, Elder Thane sat among his council of advisors, their massive tree-like forms swaying in the artificial wind of their great meeting chamber. The discussion had been going on for hours, and like similar discussions happening across the galaxy, it was getting nowhere. The humans saved the Milani, insisted Counselor Bark, his leaves rustling with conviction. They stopped a war that could have spread across half the galaxy. How can we question their motives when their actions have been so beneficial? Elder Root, one of the oldest Corvin alive, creaked as he shifted his massive trunk. "Oh, young Bark, I have seen many species rise to power. All begin by solving problems that others cannot solve. The question is not whether humans are helpful. The question is what they want in return for their help." "They have asked for nothing," Bark replied. "No tribute, no territory, no special privileges. They simply act and then return to their own." "Space, do they?" asked Elder Thane quietly. "Look at the maps, young one. Human research stations now exist in every major system. Human cultural centers operate on every civilized world. Human medical teams have genetic samples from every known species. Human merchant vessels travel every trade route in the galaxy. Tell me, what is the difference between asking for territory and simply occupying it?" The debate continued, but, like similar debates across the galaxy, it reached no conclusions. The Corvin, despite their wisdom and long experience, could not agree on whether humanity represented a threat or an opportunity. And while they debated, human influence continued to grow. Dr. Michael Chen stood in his laboratory on the Human Research Station, orbiting Vega Prime, reviewing data that would have horrified the galactic community if they had understood its implications. His official mission was still terraforming research, but his real work had evolved far beyond environmental science. "The biological profiles are complete for 43 species," reported Dr. Lisa Park as she updated the genetic databases. "We now have detailed information on immune systems, metabolic processes, reproductive cycles, and neurological structures for every major galactic civilization." Michael nodded, studying the holographic displays that showed the biological vulnerabilities of entire species. The information had been gathered through 3 years of medical missions, cultural exchanges, and scientific cooperation, every tissue sample taken for medical treatment, every genetic test performed for health screening, every biological study conducted for research had contributed to humanity's growing understanding of alien biology. "Any concerns about detection?" Michael asked. "None so far. The other species are so grateful for our medical assistance that they never question why we need such comprehensive biological data. They assume it's all part of providing proper healthcare, okay? What the alien species didn't understand was that the same information used to heal could also be used to harm. The genetic markers that helped human doctors treat alien diseases could also be used to engineer biological weapons that would affect only specific species. The neurological patterns that allowed human psychologists to provide therapy could also be used to design psychological warfare techniques tailored to alien minds. Meanwhile, Captain Ana Rodriguez had been promoted to Admiral and given command of humanity's new Galactic Peace Corps, a military force that officially existed to respond to emergencies throughout the galaxy. The Peace Corps was growing rapidly, with new ships and personnel being deployed to human bases across known space. Intelligence reports indicate that several species are becoming concerned about our expansion, reported Commander Tom Walsh during their weekly briefing aboard the flagship Resolution. The Ashali delegate continues to raise questions about our activities. Some of the Corvin are expressing doubts about our intentions. Even a few Milani are wondering why we need such a large military presence in their territory, Anna studied. the tactical displays showing human force deployments across the galaxy. What the concerned species didn't realize was that their concerns were already irrelevant. Humanity had reached the point where they no longer needed to hide their true capabilities. "Let them be concerned," Anna replied calmly. "We're past the point where their opinions matter. Begin Phase 3 operations." Phase 3 was the culmination of humanity's long-term strategy. Human colonies began revealing their true industrial capacity as massive manufacturing facilities emerged from underground installations. The pastoral farming worlds were shown to be sophisticated production centers capable of building everything from starships to weapons systems. The asteroid mining operations, which had been quietly extracting resources for years, began operating. At full capacity, the rare metals and exotic materials that humanity had been stockpiling were now being converted into military hardware at a rate that dwarfed the combined industrial output of the rest of the galaxy. Most shocking of all, humanity revealed that they had been building ships far more advanced than anything they had previously shown. The vessels that had defeated the Drachner were not humanity's most powerful warships. They were merely the ones that humans had been willing to reveal. The real human fleet was larger, more sophisticated, and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Elder Thane received the intelligence reports about human industrial capacity with a growing sense of dread. The numbers were staggering. Humanity had built the largest military-industrial complex in galactic history, while pretending to be peaceful farmers and researchers. "How is this possible?" demanded Counselor Bark, his leaves trembling with shock. "How could they have hidden so much from us for so long?" "They didn't hide it," Elder Root said sadly. "We simply chose not to see it. Every human colony that we thought was agricultural was actually industrial. Every research station that we thought was scientific was actually military. Every cultural center that we thought was educational was actually an intelligence operation. The evidence was always there. We just didn't want to believe what it meant." The revelation of humanity's true capabilities created panic in some sectors and resignation in others. A coalition of concerned species began forming, led by the remaining Drachner commanders and supported by some of the more militant races. But their attempts to organize resistance were hampered by a critical problem. Humanity knew too much about all of them. Every species that tried to build a resistance movement found their communications intercepted, their plans anticipated, and their capabilities neutralized before they could act. Human intelligence networks, built over 3 years of helpful cooperation, were too extensive and too well placed to be avoided. General Korg, the Drachner commander who had survived the defeat at Milani Prime, tried to rally his remaining forces for a counterattack against human positions. But when his fleet moved to engage human forces near the Rigel system, they found themselves facing weapons that specifically targeted Drachner biology. The human ships fired projectiles that released gases deadly to Drachner physiology, but harmless to most other species. They used sonic weapons tuned to frequencies that disrupted Drachner neural functions. They deployed energy fields that interfered with Drachner natural healing abilities. Korg's warriors, who had conquered dozens of worlds, found themselves helpless against enemies who had studied their every biological function and designed countermeasures for each one. The few ships that escaped carried reports of weapons that seemed almost magical in their effectiveness against Drachner forces. But the most devastating aspect of humanity's revelation was not their military power or their industrial capacity. It was the realization that they had been manipulating galactic civilization from the moment they joined it. Dr. Rebecca Thompson's cultural exchange programs were revealed to be sophisticated psychological operations designed to make other species more receptive to human leadership. The art, music, and literature that humans had shared were all carefully crafted to promote human values and ways of thinking. The medical missions had not just gathered biological information, it also studied how different species responded to stress, fear, and authority. The humanitarian aid had been designed to create dependency and gratitude. Scientific cooperation had been structured to ensure that humans learned more than they shared. Ambassador Marcus Williams no longer bothered to maintain his diplomatic smile during council sessions. The pretense was over and everyone knew it. When challenged about humanity's deception, he responded with cold honesty rather than warm reassurance. "We did exactly what we said we would do," Marcus told the assembled delegates during what would be the last free session of the Galactic Council. "We joined your community. We contributed to galactic peace and prosperity, and we prepared ourselves to defend our allies and interests. The fact that our preparations were more comprehensive than you realized is not our fault. It's yours for not paying attention." The truth was finally out in the open. Humanity had spent 3 years positioning themselves to control the galaxy, and they had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The only question now was what they would do with the power they had so carefully acquired. Lyra sat in the empty assembly hall after the other delegates had left, her crystal form dim with despair. She had tried to warn them, but no one had wanted to listen. Now it was too late for warnings. The galaxy had chosen to trust humanity's smile, and now they would all live with the consequences of that choice. The predator had finally revealed itself, but the prey had nowhere left to run. 6 months after humanity revealed their true capabilities, the galaxy had settled into what Ambassador Marcus Williams liked to call the new normal: resistance. Movements had crumbled, not through military defeat, but through simple economic reality. Fighting humanity had become impossible when humanity controlled the resources, the trade routes, and the information networks that kept galactic civilization functioning. The Galactic Council still met in the Great Assembly Hall of Arcturus Station. The sessions were very different now. Marcus no longer sat with the other delegates as an equal member. Instead, he occupied a raised platform at the center of the hall, with other human officials seated around him in positions that made it clear who was really in charge. The other delegates still had their seats, still had their voices, and still had their votes. But they had learned that no decision could be made without human approval, and that approval was not always guaranteed. "The proposal to establish new mining rights in the Centauri system has been reviewed," Marcus announced to the assembled delegates, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had once seemed so diplomatic. "Humanity finds the proposal acceptable with the following modifications." Elder Thane listened as Marcus listed changes that would ensure human oversight of all mining operations, human control of resource distribution, and human approval of all personnel assignments. The modifications were not suggestions. They were requirements. The Corvin Elder had learned that lesson during the first weeks of the new order. The transition had been remarkably smooth, which somehow made it more disturbing than if it had been violent. Humanity had not dissolved the Galactic Council or imposed direct military rule. They had simply made it clear that certain decisions would now require their input. Certain activities would now need their supervision, and certain policies would now reflect their priorities. When the Drachner Empire had tried to resist these new arrangements, they had found their energy supplies cut off and their trade agreements canceled. When they had threatened military action, they had discovered that their weapon systems had been secretly dependent on human-manufactured components for months. Their resistance had lasted exactly 3 days before they agreed to negotiate. Dr. Rebecca Thompson stood before a class of young aliens on the Ashali homeworld, teaching them human poetry and philosophy. Her cultural exchange programs had expanded dramatically since the revelation, but their purpose had become much more obvious. She was no longer sharing human culture. She was installing it. "Can anyone tell me what this poem means?" Rebecca asked, gesturing to the human verses displayed on the classroom screen. A young Ashali student, her crystal form glowing with enthusiasm, raised her hand. "It means that strength and wisdom must work together to create peace. That those who can protect others have the responsibility to guide them." "Excellent," Rebecca replied with genuine warmth. The student had learned the lesson perfectly. Human literature was full of stories about benevolent leaders who took control for the greater good. It's about the necessity of strong guidance for weak societies. It's about the burden of responsibility that naturally fell to superior civilizations. Made the indoctrination so effective was that it was not forced. The young aliens genuinely enjoyed human culture, found human philosophy inspiring, and voluntarily adopted human values. By the time they became adults, they would think like humans, solve problems like humans, and accept human leadership as natural and proper. Admiral Stone's Galactic Peace Corps had grown into the largest military force in the galaxy. But they rarely needed to use violence. Their mere presence was usually enough to ensure compliance with human directives. When the VEC attempted to develop independent communication networks, a single Peace Corps cruiser appearing in their system was sufficient to convince them that such projects were unnecessary. The beauty of the system was that humanity rarely had to give direct orders. Other species learned to anticipate human preferences and adjust their behavior accordingly. The result looked like voluntary cooperation rather than forced submission. Dr. Michael Chen had been promoted to Director of Galactic Health Services, a position that had not existed before humanity took control, but which now seemed essential for galactic civilization. His medical teams continued their work on dozens of worlds, but their mission had evolved beyond simple healthcare. The genetic modification programs are proceeding ahead of schedule, Dr. Lisa Park reported during their monthly review. We're now able to enhance immune systems, improve cognitive function, and extend lifespans for most galactic species. The improvements were real and beneficial. Aliens who received human medical treatment lived longer, thought more clearly, and suffered from fewer diseases. What they didn't realize was that the treatments also made them more dependent on human medical technology and more susceptible to human biological agents if they ever became necessary to use. Michael studied the reports with satisfaction. Every alien who received human medical enhancement became a living example of human benevolence. They were healthier, happier, and more productive than their unmodified relatives. Most importantly, they were proof that human rule led to better lives for everyone. The economic integration had been even more successful than the medical programs. Human industrial capacity now supplied essential goods to every major species in the galaxy. Human financial institutions managed galactic trade and commerce. Human transportation networks moved goods and people between star systems. The genius of the system was that it had grown naturally from humanity's helpful assistance during their first 3 years. Species that had once been grateful for human aid now found themselves unable to function without it. Their economies had become so intertwined with human systems that independence was no longer economically viable. Lyra sat in her quarters aboard Arcturus Station working as a cultural liaison. For the new human administration, it was ironic that the person who had tried to warn the galaxy about human intentions now worked for the humans themselves. But like most of her colleagues, she had discovered that resistance was not just futile, it was unnecessary. Her life under human rule was better than it had been under the old Galactic Council. Her species received better medical care, more advanced technology, and more economic opportunities. Crime had virtually disappeared. Conflicts between species had ended, and galactic civilization was more prosperous than ever before. The humans were not cruel masters. They were efficient, fair, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of the species under their protection. They solved problems that the old council had debated for years. It prevented wars that had once seemed inevitable. It brought order to a galaxy that had often been chaotic. Sometimes Lyra wondered if she had been wrong to oppose them. Perhaps humanity really was what the galaxy needed. Perhaps their deception had been justified by the results. Perhaps the loss of independence was a fair price for peace and prosperity. But then she would remember the expression on Marcus Williams' face when he thought no one was watching. And she would realize that the question was not whether human rule was beneficial. The question was whether the galaxy had any choice in the matter. Marcus stood in his private office, looking out at the stars through the great viewport of Arcturus Station. He was no longer an ambassador. His official title was now Secretary General of the Galactic Council. But everyone understood that he was really the governor of human space, which happened to include the entire galaxy. David Hayes entered the office carrying the daily briefings, his expression satisfied as he reviewed the latest reports. The integration programs are exceeding all projections. Resistance has dropped to negligible levels across all sectors. Economic productivity is up 18% from pre-takeover levels. Most importantly, approval ratings for human leadership are at 87% and rising. Marcus nodded, but his attention was focused on a different kind of report. Long-range sensors had detected signals from beyond the galactic rim, suggesting the existence of other civilizations in nearby galaxies. Humanity would eventually need to expand beyond their current territory, and when they did, they would need to be prepared for new challenges. Begin preliminary planning for extragalactic operations, Marcus ordered. We'll need to develop new approaches for dealing with civilizations that haven't been softened by years of cultural preparation. Yes, sir. Should we begin the same gradual approach we used here? Marcus considered the question carefully. Not immediately. We've learned a lot about efficient conquest in the past few years. Next time, we might not need to spend so much time pretending to be harmless. The irony was that humanity's rule really had brought unprecedented peace and prosperity to the galaxy. Crime was down, conflicts had ended, and most species were genuinely happier under human leadership than they had been governing themselves. The humans had not lied about their ability to solve galactic problems. They had simply omitted the detail that solving those problems required accepting human authority. Later that day, Marcus prepared for another session of the Galactic Council. A new species had recently achieved interstellar flight and requested membership in the galactic community. The Torlon were a peaceful, artistic people who reminded many observers of humanity during their first contact. Marcus reviewed the briefing. Materials about the Torlon as he walked to the assembly hall were creative, adaptable, and eager to learn from other species. They had a history of internal conflicts, but seemed to have achieved a stable, unified government. Most importantly, they appeared to be genuinely committed to peaceful coexistence with their neighbors. The assembly hall was full as Marcus took his position at the center of the chamber. Torlon ambassador, a graceful being with flowing tentacles and large, trusting eyes, stood nervously at the presentation podium. Honored members of the Galactic Council, the Torlon began. I stand before you today, representing a species that has finally learned to reach across the stars. We come not seeking dominance or advantage, but simply the opportunity to learn from and contribute to this great galactic community. Marcus listened to the familiar words with a sense of nostalgic amusement. The Torlon's speech was almost identical to the one he had given 6 years earlier. The same promises of peaceful intentions, the same expressions of humble gratitude, the same careful balance of strength and diplomacy. When the Torlon finished speaking, Marcus rose to respond. His expression was warm and welcoming. His voice carried genuine enthusiasm, and his smile seemed absolutely sincere. Ambassador Coral, on behalf of the Galactic Council, I want to welcome your species to our community. The Torlon have shown exactly the kind of wisdom and maturity that we look for in new members. I'm confident that your people will find their place among us and contribute greatly to galactic peace and prosperity. As he spoke, Marcus noticed Lyra watching him from her seat among the other delegates. For just a moment, their eyes met, and he saw that she understood exactly what was happening. The galaxy had found another species to trust, another civilization that would mistake human smiles for genuine friendship. The Torlon would be welcomed into the galactic community, just as humanity had been. They would be offered assistance and friendship, just as humanity had offered. They would be gradually integrated into the systems that humanity controlled, just as every other species had been. But unlike the old Galactic Council that had welcomed humanity, this council already knew what hidden teeth looked like behind a diplomatic smile. The difference was that now those teeth belonged to the ones in charge, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Marcus's smile widened slightly as he continued his welcoming speech. The galaxy had learned to see humanity's teeth behind their smile, but by the time they understood what they were looking at, it had been far too late to matter. Now new species would learn the same lesson, and the cycle would continue under humanity's careful guidance. After all, someone had to maintain order in the galaxy, and the humans had proven themselves uniquely qualified for the job.